Hello and welcome back. You're watching Parry This. Today we will be continuing our historical summary regarding the Hussite Wars. This video is my latest in a series of history videos discussing the real history behind the medieval RPG made by Warhorse Studios, Kingdom Come Deliverance. If you haven't watched them, specifically the one I did about Jan Hus and my part 1 video for the Hussite Wars, I obviously recommend checking them out before you continue on with this one. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive on in and learn some more about these messy wars. So last time we talked about what started the Hussite Wars, who was involved, what the reasoning was, and the tactics used by the Hussites in their struggle. Then we discussed the first two crusades that were launched against the Hussites in an attempt to stamp out their revolution. So now we'll pick up right where we left off and discuss the Hussite Civil War. Bohemia was, for a time, free from foreign intervention, but internal discord again broke out, caused partly by theological strife and partly by the ambition of agitators. Jan Žižka was on March 9th, 1422, arrested by the town council of Prague and decapitated. There were troubles at Tabor also, where a more advanced party opposed Žižka's authority. Bohemia obtained a temporary respite when, in 1422, Prince Sigismund Korybut of Lithuania, nephew to the King of Poland, briefly became ruler of the country. He was a governor sent by the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas, who accepted the Hussite proposal to be their new king. His authority was recognized by the Utraquist nobles and citizens of Prague, and the more moderate Taborites. Sigismund Korybut, however, remained a short time in Bohemia, as in 1423 he was called to come back to Lithuania, after Jagiello had made a treaty with Sigismund. On his departure, civil war broke out when the Taborites took to arms against the more moderate Utraquists, who at this period are also called the Praguers, as Prague was their principal stronghold. On April 27, 1423, Žižka, now again leading the Taborites, defeated the Utraquist army under Chenich of Wartenberg at the Battle of Horik. An armistice was concluded at Konopilt. And now we'll talk about the third anti-Hussite crusade. Papal influence had meanwhile succeeded in launching a new crusade against Bohemia, but it resulted in complete failure. In spite of their best efforts of their rulers, Poles and Lithuanians did not wish to attack their kindred Czechs. The Germans were prevented by internal squabbles from taking joint action against the Hussites, and the King of Denmark, who had landed in Germany with a large force, intending to take part in the crusade, soon returned to his own country. Free for a time from foreign aggression, the Hussites invaded Moravia, where a large part of the population favored their creed. But, paralyzed again by dissensions, they soon returned to Bohemia. The city of Hradec Králové, which had been under Utraquist rule, espoused the doctrine of Tabor and called Žižka to its aid. After several military successes gained by Žižka in 1423 and the following year, a treaty of peace between the Hussites was concluded on September 13, 1424, at Liban, a village near Prague, now part of that city. In 1426, the Hussites were again attacked by foreign enemies. In June of that year, their forces, led by Prokop the Great, who took the command of the Taborites shortly after Žižka's death in October of 1424, and Sigismund Korybut, who had returned to Bohemia, singly defeated the Germans at Ústí nad Labem. After this great victory and another at the Battle of Tachov in 1427, the Hussites repeatedly invaded Germany, though they had made no attempt to occupy permanently any part of the country. From 1421 to 1427, the Hussites received military support from the Poles. Poland, though a devoutly Catholic nation, was supporting the Hussites on a non-religious ground. Poland's motive was revenge against Germany for the Polish-Lithuanian Teutonic War of 1409 to 1411. And if you want to know more about that, check out my Knights of the Teutonic Order video, which I did in my history series about the Crusades. That'll really help shed some light on that. Because of this, Jan Žižka arranged for the crown of Bohemia to be offered to Jagiello, the King of Poland, who, under pressure from his own advisors, refused it. The crown was then offered to Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, and Vytautas accepted it, with the condition that the Hussites reunite with the Catholic Church. In 1422, Žižka accepted the Polish king's nephew, Sigismund Korybut, as the regent of Bohemia for Vytautas. Korybut never managed to return the Hussites to the Catholic Church, and he even had to resort to force of arms when dealing with the various factions. Korybut did not tolerate the Protestant rebels breaking their promise of reuniting with the Catholic Church. On a few occasions, he even fought against both the Taborites and the Oroborites to try to force them into reuniting. Large-scale Polish involvement was ended in 1427, when Korybut was arrested by the Hussites after Polish plans to hand over the Hussite forces to Emperor Sigismund were discovered. The Poles, however, did not really want to withdraw. The only reason they did this is because the Pope planned to call a crusade against Poland if they did not. Spaniel Jizdi, or beautiful rides, as the Hussites called them, were undertaken in many different foreign lands. Throughout the Hussite Wars, especially under the leadership of Prokop the Great, invasions were made into Silesia, Saxony, Hungary, Lusatia, and Meissen. Every raid that the Hussites carried out was against a country that had supplied the Germans with men during the anti-Hussite crusades. These raids were made to try and strike enough fear into these areas to make sure that they would not help the Germans again. However, the raids did not have the desired effect. These countries kept supplying soldiers to the crusades against the Hussites. During yet another war between Poland and the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights, some Hussite raiders helped the Poles. In 1433, a Hussite army of 7,000 fighting men marched through Neumark into Prussia and captured Dürschau on the Vistula River. They would eventually reach the mouth of the Vistula, where it enters the Baltic Sea near Danzig. There they performed a great victory celebration to show that nothing but the ocean could stop the Hussites. The Prussian historian Heinrich von Treitschke would later write that they had greeted the sea with a wild Czech song about God's warriors, and filled their water bottles with the brine in token that the Baltic once more obeyed the Slavs. The almost uninterrupted series of victories by the Hussites led many to realize that they were not going to defeat them by force of arms. Also, the conspicuously democratic character of the Hussite movement caused the German princes, who were afraid that such views might extend to their own countries, to desire peace. Many Hussites, particularly the Utraquist clergy, were also in favor of peace. Negotiations for this purpose were to take place at the Ecumenical Council, which had been summoned to meet at Basel on March 3, 1431. The Roman See reluctantly consented to the presence of heretics at this council, but indignantly rejected the suggestion of the Hussites that members of the Greek Church and representatives of all Christian creeds should also be present. Before definitively giving its consent to peace negotiations, the Roman Church determined on making a last effort to defeat the Hussites. On August 1st, 1431, a large army of crusaders under Frederick, Margrave of Brandenburg, whom Cardinal Cesarini accompanied as papal legate, crossed the Bohemian border, and on 14th of August, the crusaders reached the town of Domaschlitz. When the Hussite army arrived, reinforced with some 6,000 Polish Hussites, and under the command of Prokop, or, as the legend has it, upon seeing the Hussite banners and hearing their battle hymn, "Ye who are warriors of God," the crusaders immediately took to flight. On October 15th, the members of the council, already assembled at Basel, issued a formal invitation to the Hussites to take part in its deliberations. Prolonged negotiations ensued, but finally a Hussite embassy led by Prokop and including Jan of Rocian, the Taborite bishop Nicholas of Pelhřimov, and the English Hussite Peter Payne, and many others, arrived at Basel on January 4th, 1433. It was found impossible to reach an agreement. Negotiations were not, however, broken off, and a change in the political situation of Bohemia finally resulted in a settlement. In 1434, war again broke out between the Utraquists and the Taborites. On May 30th of that year, the Taborite army, led by Prokop the Great and Prokop the Lesser, who both fell in the battle, was totally defeated and almost annihilated at Lipany. An end to the Polish Hussite movement in Poland would arrive as well. The Polish Hussites, often reinforced by their Czech Slav brethren, had been raiding there for years, and the Royal Polish forces under Vladislav III of Varna would defeat the Hussites at the Battle of Grotniki, bringing the Hussite wars to an end. The moderate party, or Utraquists, thus obtained the upper hand, and it formulated its demands in a document which was finally accepted by the Church of Rome, in a slightly modified form, and which is known as the Compacts. The Compacts, mainly founded on the Articles of Prague, declare that, number 1, the Holy Sacrament is to be given freely in both kinds to all Christians in Bohemia and Moravia, and to those elsewhere who adhere to the faith of those two countries. Number 2, all mortal sins shall be punished and extirpated by those whose office it is to do so. Number 3, the word of God is to be freely and truthfully preached by the priests of the Lord and by worthy deacons. And number 4, The priests in the time of the law of grace shall claim no ownership of worldly possessions. On July 5th, 1436, the compacts were formally accepted and signed at Jelava in Moravia by King Sigismund, by the Hussite delegates, and by the representatives of the Roman Catholic Church. The last named, however, refused to recognize as Archbishop of Prague John of Rokycan, who had been elected to that dignity by the Estates of Bohemia. The aftermath of the Hussite Wars is essentially as follows. The Utraquist creed, frequently varying in its details, continued to be that of the established Church of Bohemia until all non-Catholic religious services were prohibited shortly after the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620. The Taborite party never recovered from its defeat at Lipa, and after the town of Tabor had been captured by George of Taborite in 1452, Utraquist religious worship was established there. The Bohemian Brethren, whose intellectual originator was Peter Chelshicki, but whose actual founders were Brother Gregory, a nephew of Archbishop Rokycan, and Michael, curate of Zamber, to a certain extent continued the Taborite traditions, and in the 15th and 16th centuries included most of the strongest opponents of Rome in Bohemia. J.A. Kamensky, a member of the Brotherhood, claimed for the members of his church that they were the genuine inheritors of the doctrines of Hus. After the beginning of the German Reformation, many Utraquists adopted to a large extent the doctrines of Martin Luther and of John Calvin, and in 1567 obtained the repeal of the compacts, which no longer seemed sufficiently far-reaching. From the end of the 16th century, the inheritors of the Hussite tradition in Bohemia were included in the more general name of Protestants, which they shared with other supporters of the Reformation. While these videos are certainly not all-encompassing historical accounts of the Hussite Wars, I did cover most, if not all, of the most important factors and events, so you should now know much more than the average bear about arguably the most important conflict in Bohemian history. There are a lot of additional facts that I did not include in these videos. My favorite of which is that on March 23rd, 1430, Joan of Arc dictated a letter threatening to lead a crusading army against the Hussites unless they returned to the Catholic faith and the original light. And if you would like to learn more about Joan of Arc, Miss History actually did a full biography on her a while back, which I will link in the description. In any case, that's where we are going to leave off for this video. I hope you found it both educational and interesting, as I tried to leave out any unnecessary details to make sure that the meat and potatoes of this topic would be easy to digest. So, thanks for watching and have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.